I gave my only pair of winter boots to a stranger on a frozen bench, not knowing he could have bought the entire city if he wanted to. The wind that morning cut through my coat like it had something personal against me, sharp and relentless, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. And I remember thinking that even the sky looked tired, stretched thin and gray over the streets of Chicago, as if it had given up trying to be anything but heavy. I had been walking for nearly 30 minutes, my old sneakers soaked through from slush, each step sending a chill straight up my legs. But I kept going because the bus fare had gone up again that week, and I had learned over the past few years that there were things you simply stopped affording without ever making a formal decision about it. At 68, I had expected life to slow down, maybe soften a little, but instead it had narrowed, tightened into something smaller and quieter, a routine of careful choices and silent compromises that no one else ever seemed to notice. My name is Margaret Collins, and if you had passed me that morning, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. Most people didn't. I was just another older woman moving carefully along the sidewalk, one gloved hand gripping the strap of a worn handbag, the other tucked deep into my coat pocket, trying to preserve whatever warmth I had left. I remember reaching the park almost by accident, my feet aching enough that I needed to sit down, even if only for a minute, and there it was, that bench near the edge of the path, half covered in snow, the metal armrests frosted over, the wood stiff and unwelcoming. I brushed off a small patch with my sleeve and lowered myself down, exhaling slowly as the cold seeped through immediately, sharper than I expected, but still better than standing. That's when I noticed him. He was already there, sitting at the far end of the bench, hunched slightly, his coat thin and worn in a way that made it hard to tell how old it actually was, his hands bare, resting loosely in his lap as if he had stopped trying to warm them. At first I thought he might be asleep, but then he shifted, just slightly, and I saw his eyes open, clear and observant in a way that didn't quite match the rest of him. He didn't ask me for anything. That was the first thing that struck me. No request, no gesture, no attempt to draw attention to himself the way people sometimes do when they need help but don't want to say it out loud. He just sat there, quiet, as the wind moved around us, carrying the faint sound of traffic and the distant hum of the city continuing without us. I looked down at his shoes, if you could call them that, the soles worn thin, the fabric darkened from damp, and I noticed the way his toes pressed forward slightly, as if even sitting still wasn't enough to keep the cold from reaching him. I don't remember making a decision. It wasn't something I thought through or weighed against my own situation. It was just a moment, small and simple, the kind that passes quickly if you let it. I bent down, slowly, my fingers stiff as I pulled at the laces of my boots, the ones I had saved up for last winter, the ones that had kept me going through mornings just like this. The cold hit me immediately as I slipped them off, sharper now, more direct, but I ignored it. "Here," I said, my voice quieter than I expected, holding them out toward him. For a second, he didn't move, just looked at me as if he was trying to understand something I hadn't said. "You'll need these more than I do today," I added, and that was the truth, at least in that moment. He hesitated, then reached for them carefully, almost respectfully, as if they were something fragile instead of worn leather and rubber. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, deeper than I expected, carrying a kind of calm that didn't match the situation at all. As he slipped them on, I stood up again, my feet already stinging against the frozen ground inside my thin shoes, but I didn't stay long enough to see how they fit. I just nodded once, a small gesture, and turned back toward the sidewalk, pulling my coat tighter around me as I started walking again. Behind me, I heard him speak one more time, not loudly, but clearly enough that the words carried through the cold air. "Kindness always finds its way back, Mrs. Collins." I stopped for just a fraction of a second, my breath catching slightly, because I was certain I hadn't told him my name. But by the time I turned around, the bench was empty, and the only thing left was the faint impression in the snow where he had been sitting. I walked the rest of the way home without my boots, each step slower than the last, the cold rising from the pavement and settling deep into my feet, until it felt like I was no longer walking on the ground, but on something hollow and distant. And yet, I did not stop, because stopping meant feeling it more, and I had learned over the years that movement, even painful movement, was sometimes the only thing that kept you from thinking too much. By the time I reached my building, my toes were numb, my fingers stiff even inside my gloves, and the familiar brick facade looked exactly as it always did, worn but steady, the kind of place that did not ask questions and did not offer comfort either. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, listening to the quiet echo of my own steps in the hallway, and when I reached my apartment, I paused for a moment before unlocking the door, as if something inside might have changed while I was gone, even though I knew it had not. The room was exactly as I had left it, small and tidy, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence, and I set my bag down on the kitchen table before removing my damp shoes, noticing the faint redness along my toes as the warmth of the room began to return to them in uneven waves. I wrapped them in a towel, sat down, and let the quiet settle around me again, the kind of quiet that does not feel peaceful, but simply empty. It had been 3 years since my husband passed, and in that time the house had not grown louder or more alive the way I once thought it might. It had only become more precise, more still, as if every object had learned its place and refused to move from it.
My son David used to call more often in the beginning, short conversations that carried a careful tone, as if he was trying to balance something he could not quite name, but over time those calls became less frequent, spaced out between long silences that I stopped trying to fill. After he married Laura, things changed in ways that were difficult to explain and even harder to confront. It was not one moment or one decision, but a series of small adjustments, invitations that arrived later and later until they stopped altogether, conversations that felt shorter, more distracted, as if there was always something else waiting on the other end of the line that mattered more. I never asked him directly. I told myself that people get busy, that life moves forward in ways that do not always include everyone, and that holding on too tightly only makes things worse. Still, there were moments when the absence felt heavier than usual, like on holidays when I set the table for 1 instead of 3, or on evenings when the television filled the room with voices that did not belong to me. I stood up slowly and made myself a cup of tea, the simple routine grounding in a way that nothing else seemed to be. And as I waited for the kettle to boil, I found my thoughts drifting back to the man on the bench, to the way he had looked at me, not with gratitude exactly, but with something quieter, something measured. And then there was the sentence he had spoken, clear and certain, as if it carried a meaning I had not yet understood. Kindness always finds its way back, Mrs. Collins. I had not told him my name. I was sure of that. The realization settled slowly, not as a shock, but as a small, persistent question that refused to disappear.
I tried to dismiss it, to fold it into the long list of things that did not quite make sense, but did not require an answer either. Yet it lingered, repeating itself in the back of my mind as I moved through the rest of the day. I sat by the window for a while, watching the light fade from the sky, the city shifting from gray to a muted blue as evening approached. And for a brief moment, I wondered if I should have stayed, if I should have asked him how he knew or why he had said it that way. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. I had done what felt right in that moment, and that had always been enough for me. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and I pulled my sweater tighter around me, suddenly aware again of the absence of my boots, of the small decision that had already begun to reshape something in my day in a way I could not yet see. Somewhere between the quiet of my apartment and the fading light outside, a strange feeling settled in, not quite worry, not quite anticipation, but something in between, as if the ordinary rhythm of my life had shifted slightly, just enough to remind me that even the smallest moments can carry consequences you do not recognize until much later.
The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because something in me refused to settle back into sleep, as if my mind had been quietly working through the night, turning over a moment I could not quite let go of. The apartment was still dim, the pale winter light just beginning to press through the edges of the curtains.
and I lay there for a few seconds, listening to the steady hum of the heater and the faint sound of traffic beginning to build outside, the city slowly waking up without asking whether I was ready to follow. I sat up carefully, feeling the familiar stiffness in my joints, and for a brief second, I forgot about the boots, until my feet touched the floor and the cold reminder came back to me all at once. I moved through my morning routine more slowly than usual, making coffee, setting a single plate on the table, and glancing toward the empty chair across from me without thinking, a habit that had never quite left, even after all this time. As I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, I found my thoughts drifting back again, not to the cold or the discomfort, but to the man's voice, steady and certain, the way he had said my name as if it belonged in that moment. I tried to reason it out. Maybe I had mentioned it without realizing. Maybe he had overheard it somewhere. The explanations felt thin even as I formed them, and I set the thought aside, telling myself that not everything needed to make sense.
After breakfast, I pulled on my coat and stepped outside again, this time wearing an older pair of shoes I had not used in years, the soles thinner, the fit less comfortable, but still enough to get me where I needed to go. The air was just as sharp as the day before, the sidewalks still lined with patches of ice and snow that had been pushed aside but not cleared, and I walked carefully, watching each step, aware that a small misstep could turn into something much larger than I could afford. I had a few errands to run, nothing urgent, just the kind of small tasks that fill a day when there is no one waiting for you anywhere else. At the grocery store, I moved slowly through the aisles, comparing prices the way I always did, calculating quietly in my head, choosing what I could afford rather than what I might have wanted. And when I reached the register, I noticed the cashier glance briefly at my shoes before looking away, not unkindly, but with the quick, practiced awareness people develop when they are trying not to stare. I did not take it personally. I had learned a long time ago that most people were simply passing through their own lives, noticing things only long enough to move past them. When I returned to my building, there was an envelope waiting for me in the small metal mailbox downstairs, tucked between a flyer and a utility notice, plain and unmarked, except for my name written in clean, precise lettering. I held it for a moment longer than necessary, turning it over in my hands as if it might offer some clue about where it had come from, but there was nothing. No return address, no stamp that stood out, just my name and the quiet weight of something I had not been expecting. I carried it upstairs with me, setting it on the kitchen table without opening it right away, as if giving myself a few extra seconds might somehow prepare me for whatever was inside. The apartment felt quieter than usual, the kind of silence that seems to listen back, and I sat down slowly, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the envelope. I told myself it was probably nothing important, just another notice, another piece of paper to file away and forget, but something about it did not feel ordinary. After a moment, I slid my finger carefully under the seal and opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper, thicker than the kind I was used to receiving, the texture smooth and deliberate. My eyes moved across the first line, and I felt a small shift in my chest. Not quite surprise, not quite recognition, but something that made me sit a little straighter without fully understanding why. The words were simple, but they did not feel accidental, and as I continued reading, the quiet rhythm of my morning began to change in a way I could not yet explain, as if the day ahead had already been decided somewhere beyond my reach, waiting for me to catch up to it. I read the letter twice before I fully understood what it was saying, not because the words were complicated, but because they felt out of place in my life, like something that had been meant for someone else and had somehow ended up in my hands by mistake. The paper was thick and smooth, the kind you do not usually see unless it comes from a place that values appearances, and the message itself was brief, written in a tone that was polite but direct, as if it expected to be taken seriously without needing to explain why. It invited me to visit an address downtown, a building I recognized immediately by name, even though I had never set foot inside it. One of those places you pass by and assume belongs to a world that does not include you. There was no long explanation, no detailed introduction, just a reference to our meeting the day before and a simple request that I come at a specific time. I sat there for a while,
the letter resting in my hands, the quiet of the apartment pressing in around me as I tried to decide what to make of it. Part of me wanted to dismiss it entirely, to fold it back into the envelope and set it aside as something that did not require my attention. But the memory of that bench, of his voice, of the way he had said my name without hesitation, would not let me do that so easily.
I stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the street below, watching people move along the sidewalk with purpose, their steps quick, their attention focused on where they were going. And I wondered when I had stopped moving like that, when my own days had become something to move through rather than toward. The address on the letter was not far in terms of distance, but it felt far in every other way, as if going there meant stepping into a version of the city I had only ever observed from the outside. I told myself there was no harm in going, that I could always leave if it turned out to be nothing, and yet the decision did not come as easily as I expected. It was not fear exactly, but something quieter, a hesitation rooted in the understanding that once you step into something unfamiliar, you do not always return unchanged. I placed the letter back on the table and made myself another cup of tea, more out of habit than necessity, and as I waited for the water to heat, I found myself thinking about the past few years, about how small my world had become without me fully noticing, how the edges had gradually pulled inward until everything fit neatly into a space I could manage on my own. There had been a time when I would have told someone about this, when I would have picked up the phone and asked for an opinion, but those instincts had faded along with the conversations that used to fill my evenings. When the tea was ready, I carried it to the table and sat down again, the envelope still lying where I had left it, as if waiting for me to make up my mind. I picked it up once more, running my fingers lightly over the surface, and this time I noticed something I had missed before, a small embossed mark in the corner, subtle but unmistakable, a symbol I had seen in passing on buildings, on news segments, attached to stories about companies and people whose lives operated on a scale I could not quite imagine. The recognition settled in slowly, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet shift in understanding, and I felt something change in the way I looked at the letter, as if it had gained weight simply by being connected to something larger than itself. I set my cup down carefully and stood up, the decision forming not as a dramatic moment, but as a simple conclusion that there was only one way to understand what this meant. I would go. Not because I expected anything, and not because I believed this would lead to something significant, but because ignoring it would leave a question behind, and I had lived long enough to know that unanswered questions have a way of lingering far longer than you intend. I moved to the bedroom and opened the closet, scanning the few options I had, choosing something clean and presentable, even if it was not new, even if it did not match the kind of place I was about to visit, because there is a certain dignity in showing up as you are, even when you know it may not be enough. As I dressed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, the lines on my face more pronounced in the morning light, my hair neatly pulled back, my expression calm but attentive, and I realized that whatever waited for me at that address, I would meet it the same way I had met everything else in my life, quietly, without expectation, and without asking for more than I had been given. When I stepped out of the apartment and closed the door behind me, the letter tucked securely into my bag, the air in the hallway felt the same as always, still and familiar, but something in me had shifted, just enough to make the day feel different, as if the path ahead had already begun to unfold in ways I had not yet seen. I took the train downtown because it felt like the most practical choice, even though part of me wondered if I should have walked just to give myself more time to think. But the cold had not softened since yesterday, and the city moved at its own pace, whether I was ready or not. The ride was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from people being wrapped in their own thoughts, staring at their phones or out the windows as the buildings passed by in a blur of gray and glass. And I sat near the corner, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the envelope resting inside my bag like something that carried more weight than it should. When I stepped off at my stop, the difference was immediate. The streets wider, the sidewalks cleaner, the air somehow sharper, as if even the cold behaved differently in this part of the city. The building stood exactly where I expected it to, tall and precise, its glass exterior reflecting the pale sky above, the kind of place that did not need to announce its importance because it was already understood.
I slowed my steps as I approached, not out of fear, but out of habit, the instinct to observe before entering something unfamiliar. And I noticed the way people moved in and out of the doors with quiet confidence, their coats tailored, their shoes clean, their movements unhurried in a way that suggested they belonged there. For a brief moment, I considered turning around, telling myself that I had come far enough, that whatever this was did not need to be followed through. But the thought passed quickly, replaced by the simple understanding that I had already made the decision when I left my apartment.
Inside, the lobby was warm and still, the kind of warmth that feels intentional rather than incidental, and the floors shone under the overhead lights, reflecting the movement of people crossing from one side to the other. A woman behind the front desk looked up as I entered, her expression neutral but attentive, and I approached slowly, offering a small, polite smile as I explained that I had received a letter asking me to come. She asked for my name, and when I said it, something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. She nodded once, then picked up the phone, speaking quietly for a few seconds before setting it down again and gesturing toward the elevators. There was no hesitation in her voice, no confusion about why I was there, as if my arrival had been expected in a way I had not fully believed until that moment. I thanked her and moved toward the elevators, my steps steady even as my thoughts continued to turn over the possibilities of what I might find upstairs. The ride was smooth and silent, the numbers lighting up one by one as the elevator moved higher, and I found myself watching them closely, as if each floor brought me closer to something that could not be undone once reached. When the doors opened, the space beyond was quieter than I expected, a hallway lined with glass walls and soft lighting, the kind of place where even footsteps seemed to lower themselves out of respect.
A man in a dark suit stood near the end of the corridor, his posture straight, his attention focused in a way that suggested he had been waiting, and when he saw me, he stepped forward with a calm, professional expression. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice measured, as if confirming something he already knew, and I nodded, offering the same small smile I had given downstairs. He gestured for me to follow him, and I did, not asking questions, not because I did not have any, but because I had learned that sometimes answers reveal themselves more clearly when you allow them to arrive in their own time. As we walked, I noticed the details around me, the quiet hum of the building, the subtle reflections in the glass, the sense that everything here operated with intention, nothing out of place, nothing left to chance. He stopped in front of a set of doors and opened one for me, stepping aside to let me enter first, and as I crossed the threshold, I felt that same quiet shift again, the one that had begun the moment I opened the letter, now settling into something more defined, as if the day I had stepped into was finally ready to show me why it had unfolded the way it had.
The room was larger than I expected, but not in a way that felt overwhelming, just quiet and deliberate, with wide windows that looked out over the city, and furniture arranged with a kind of simplicity that suggested everything had been chosen for a reason rather than for display. And for a moment I stood just inside the doorway, taking it in without moving, as if the space itself required a certain stillness before you stepped further into it. The man who had led me there remained by the door, not intruding, not speaking, simply present in a way that felt respectful. And then, from across the room, I heard a voice that I recognized immediately, calm and steady, the same voice that had spoken to me on the bench. "Mrs. Collins," he said, and when I turned, I saw him standing near the window, no longer wrapped in that worn coat, but dressed in a dark suit that fit him perfectly, his posture straight, his presence composed in a way that made everything around him seem to adjust accordingly. For a second, I did not move, not because I was surprised in the way people expect surprise to feel, but because the image in front of me did not match the memory I had carried with me, and it took a moment for the two to settle into the same understanding. He stepped forward slowly, not closing the distance completely, but enough to make it clear that this was not a coincidence, not something accidental that had happened to bring us together again. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone measured, as if this meeting had already been decided long before I opened that letter. I nodded once, my hands still at my sides, and answered simply, "I was curious," because that was the truth, even if it did not explain everything I was feeling in that moment. He smiled slightly, not broadly, but with a quiet acknowledgement, as if curiosity was exactly what he had expected from me. "That is a good reason," he replied, and then gestured toward a chair nearby, inviting me to sit. I crossed the room slowly, my steps steady, and lowered myself into the chair, noticing the way the fabric felt firm and supportive beneath me, a small detail that did not escape my attention, because I had grown used to noticing such things. He remained standing for a moment longer, then moved to sit across from me, maintaining a distance that felt intentional, neither too close nor too far, as if he understood the balance of space better than most people. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence did not feel uncomfortable, only expectant, like a pause that carried its own meaning. Then he leaned back slightly and looked at me with that same steady expression I had seen the day before. "I owe you an explanation," he said, not as an apology, but as a statement of fact, and I inclined my head slightly, allowing him to continue without interruption. "My name is Daniel Wigmore," he added, and though the name was familiar, it did not land with the kind of immediate recognition it might have once, because over time I had stopped following the movements of people whose lives existed far outside my own. Still, I understood enough to know that this was not an ordinary introduction, and I listened as he continued. "Yesterday was not an accident," he said, his voice remaining calm, his gaze steady. "I was there because I wanted to be there, and I was watching, not for anything specific, but for something genuine."
I did not respond right away because the words required a moment to settle, and when I did speak, it was only to ask, "And you found it?" He held my gaze for a second longer before answering. "Yes," he said simply, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that felt more grounded than anything else in the room. I considered that for a moment, not as a compliment, but as a piece of information that needed to be understood in its proper place. And I realized then that whatever this meeting was meant to be, it was not about chance, and it was not about coincidence. It was something else entirely, something that had begun the moment I chose to act without expecting anything in return. And now, sitting there across from him, I could feel the shape of that decision beginning to reveal itself in ways I had not anticipated.
I did not react the way most people might expect when he said his name, because recognition for me has never been about status or headlines, but about presence, about the way someone carries themselves when they believe no one important is watching. And I had already seen that version of him the day before, sitting quietly on a frozen bench without asking for anything. "You were testing people," I said after a moment, not accusing, not impressed, just stating what seemed obvious now that the pieces were beginning to fall into place. He did not deny it. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I was observing," he replied, and there was a difference in the way he chose that word, something more precise, less detached than testing. I considered that quietly, letting the silence stretch for a second before speaking again. "And what happens after you observe something genuine?" I asked, because that seemed to be the question that mattered more than anything else in that room. He looked at me for a moment, as if measuring not my words, but the intention behind them. And then he said, "That depends on the person." There was no promise in his tone, no performance, just a calm statement that left the responsibility of meaning somewhere between us. I nodded slightly, not pressing further, because I had learned that people reveal more when they are not pushed to explain themselves too quickly. He stood up then, moving toward the window, his hands resting lightly at his sides as he looked out over the city below. And for a brief moment, he seemed less like the man who owned the building, and more like someone who had simply stepped into a quiet space to think.
"Most people assume generosity comes from having more than enough," he said after a few seconds, still facing the glass. "But what interests me is when it comes from having very little." I did not respond immediately, because his words were not unfamiliar to me, just rarely spoken aloud in a place like this. "It is easier to give when it does not cost you anything," I said eventually, my voice steady, "but that is not what you were looking for." He turned back then, a faint smile touching his expression, not out of amusement, but recognition. "No," he said simply, and for a moment there was something almost human in the way the conversation settled between us, stripped of titles and expectations. He walked back toward his desk and picked up a small folder, placing it on the table between us with a deliberate motion. Not rushed, not dramatic, just precise. "I would like to offer you something," he said, and I felt the shift in the room immediately, not because of the words themselves, but because of the weight they carried in a place like this. I did not reach for the folder right away. Instead, I looked at him, holding his gaze with the same calm I had brought into the room. "Why?" I asked, not out of disbelief, but because I needed to understand the reason, not the gesture. He did not hesitate. "Because you acted without expectation," he said, "and that is rare enough to matter." The answer was simple, but it did not feel empty, and I could sense that whatever was inside that folder had been decided before I arrived. I placed my hands lightly on the table, still not opening it, and for a moment I let the quiet return, the kind of quiet that allows you to hear your own thoughts clearly. I thought about the past few years, about the way my life had narrowed, about the absence of voices that used to fill my days, and about the small, quiet decisions that had shaped the person sitting in that chair. "And if I say no?" I asked, because that possibility mattered just as much as any offer he could make. He did not seem surprised by the question. In fact, he nodded slightly, as if he had expected it. "Then nothing changes," he said, his voice steady, "and I will respect that." There was no pressure in his tone, no attempt to persuade, and that, more than anything else, told me that whatever this was, it was not about control or obligation. It was a choice, one that belonged entirely to me. I looked down at the folder then, my fingers resting lightly against its edge, aware that opening it would not just reveal what was inside, but would also mark a point where something in my life could begin to shift in a way I had not planned. And yet, as I sat there, I realized that the moment had already begun the day before, on that bench, when I chose to give something away without asking what I might receive in return. And now, all that remained was to decide what I would do with what had come back to me. I did not open the folder right away, because I understood that once I did, whatever was inside would no longer be abstract. It would become something real, something that would ask something of me in return, even if no one said it out loud. And I had spent enough years learning that every opportunity carries its own quiet expectations. I lifted it slowly, feeling the weight of it in my hands, and then I opened it with the same care I had used the day before when I untied my boots, not rushing, not hesitating, simply allowing the moment to unfold as it was meant to. Inside were documents, neatly arranged, each page precise and intentional, outlining things I had not imagined for myself in a very long time. A place to live that did not require calculation. A financial arrangement that removed the constant background noise of worry. And something else that caught my attention more than anything written in numbers or terms. A role, small but defined, within a foundation that focused on community outreach, on people who had been overlooked in the same quiet ways I had come to recognize in my own life. I read through it once, then again, not because I doubted what I was seeing, but because I needed to understand it fully, to make sure that what was being offered was not just comfort, but meaning. When I looked up, he was watching me, not impatient, not expectant, just present, as if he understood that this decision would not be made quickly or lightly. "It is not charity," he said, as if responding to a question I had not spoken. "It is an exchange of perspective." I considered that, letting the words settle, and I realized that what he was offering was not simply a way out of difficulty, but a way into something else, something that required me to remain who I was rather than become someone different. "You want me to be involved," I said, not asking but confirming, and he nodded once. "You see things that others do not," he replied, "because you have lived in the spaces most people avoid." There was no exaggeration in his tone, no attempt to elevate me beyond what I was, and that made the words easier to accept. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, my hands resting on either side of it as I thought about what this would mean, not just in practical terms, but in the quiet, daily ways that shape a life. I thought about my apartment, about the routines that had become familiar not because they were fulfilling, but because they were manageable,
And I thought about the absence of conversation, the way days could pass without anyone noticing whether I had spoken or not. This offer did not erase those years, but it acknowledged them in a way that felt honest. "I do not want to be a symbol," I said after a moment, my voice steady, because that mattered more to me than anything written on those pages. He did not interrupt, did not correct me, just listened. "If I accept this," I continued, "it is because I can contribute something real, not because I was standing in the right place at the right time." He nodded again, a small, deliberate movement. "That is exactly why I asked you here," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice. I looked at the folder one more time, then back at him, and in that moment I understood that this was not about changing who I was, but about allowing that person to exist in a space where it could be seen and used in a way that mattered. I reached forward and closed the folder completely, my decision settling into place without the need for further discussion. "Then I will accept," I said, not with excitement, not with disbelief, but with a quiet certainty that felt more grounded than anything else I had experienced in a long time. He inclined his head slightly, not as a gesture of approval, but of acknowledgement, as if the outcome had always been secondary to the choice itself. The room seemed to shift after that, not physically, but in the way it held us. The conversation no longer centered on possibility, but on what would come next. And as I sat there, I realized that the cold from the day before had already begun to fade, replaced by something steadier, something that did not depend on what I had lost, but on what I had chosen to give, and what had found its way back to me in return.
The days that followed did not change all at once, and I think that is what made them feel real, not like something sudden or unreal, but like a quiet shift that settled into place over time, one decision leading naturally into the next, without demanding attention or explanation. The apartment I had lived in for years remained exactly as I left it for a little while longer, not because I needed it, but because I understood that leaving something behind properly requires a certain respect for what it once was, and I moved through those final days there with the same calm I had carried into that office, packing my belongings slowly, deciding what mattered, not by value, but by meaning. The new place was different in ways that were difficult to describe at first, not simply larger or more comfortable, but quieter in a way that did not feel empty, as if the space itself had been designed to hold a life rather than contain it. And I found myself noticing small things again, the way the light moved across the room in the afternoon, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the absence of that constant underlying tension I had grown used to without realizing it. The work with the foundation began gradually, not with grand meetings or formal introductions, but with simple conversations, listening more than speaking, observing the same way I had always done, except now there were people who valued that perspective, who asked questions and waited for answers instead of moving on too quickly. I did not try to become someone else in that space, and no one asked me to. I showed up as I was, with the same habits, the same quiet way of noticing details others overlooked, and for the first time in a long while, those things were not dismissed or ignored. They were used. It was not long before my son reached out again. The call came in the evening, his voice familiar but carrying something new, a careful tone that reminded me of the early days after his father passed, when he was not sure how to speak to me without saying the wrong thing. He asked how I was, and this time I answered honestly, not with details meant to impress or reassure, but with the simple truth that I was doing well. There was a pause on the line, not long, but enough to say more than his words did, and then he asked if we could meet, if we could talk. I agreed, not because I needed anything from him, but because some doors are better left open than closed, even if you choose not to walk through them the same way again. When we met, I noticed the way he looked at me, not with pity or obligation, but with something closer to recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. And beside him, Laura stood a little quieter than I remembered, her usual certainty softened into something more measured. They spoke carefully, offering explanations that I did not interrupt, apologies that I did not reject, and when they were finished, I simply nodded, not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be. The balance had already shifted, not in a way that required confrontation, but in a way that made it clear where I stood, and that was enough. I continued my work, my days filling with purpose in a way that felt steady rather than overwhelming. And sometimes, when I walked through the city, I found myself passing by that same park, the same bench, now cleared of snow, ordinary again, just another place people sat without thinking twice. I never saw him there again, not in that way, not as the man I had first met, but that did not matter. Some moments are not meant to repeat themselves, only to begin something that continues in a different form. And as I moved forward, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. That what changes a life is not always the grand decisions or the dramatic turns, but the quiet choices made when no one is watching. The moments when you give without expecting anything in return, and in doing so, you reveal something about yourself that cannot be taken away or overlooked. They had seen me when I had something to offer them, when I fit into the shape they expected. But he had seen me when I had nothing left to prove, nothing left to gain. And in that moment, I realized that the value of a life is not measured by what you hold on to, but by what you are willing to give away, even when no one is there to notice.